This is a video blog in response to the evaluation question number 1, which asks us, in which ways is your media product use, develop or challenge forms and conventions of real media products? I split this into a couple of different subsections in order for it to be more clear as to which parts of my film and which aspects of it relate to the question itself. So the first I did was narrative. So the film follows a stereotypical linear narrative. This is a convention of most films of a horror psychological thriller genre. So it follows a chronological structure that the audience can easily understand. However, we challenge part of the convention by adding different dual narratives, flashbacks throughout the opening scenes. So this not only reveals more about the narrative itself, but it also explains the story more fully. Considering it's only a 2-minute opening, you're not going to get much information about the narrative if you weren't to have the dual narrative structure. So we decided to include the flashbacks alongside the main narrative in order to challenge the audience's expectation of this genre of film. Then moving on to mise en scène, we looked at lighting. So we used lighting throughout the film opening in a way that conforms to the stereotypes of a psychological thriller horror. We used quite dull lighting to create a sinister, intense atmosphere. This could then be used to conform to the conventions of the other horror thriller genres that we looked at in our research part. So we just tried to reproduce those same feelings that we'd seen generated by the other types of films. So the shadows that we cast through the positioning of the lighting helped us to produce these feelings. Often horror thriller genre film shadows are used to suggest the presence of omniscient characters, but in our film we also use these to reveal the characters' feelings. So the lighting is similar to a movie that we looked at called Seven, which cast shadows on the omniscient characters' faces. So by using this, when we see omniscient characters in our film, we sort of replicated that same technique. So it's extremely low lit, and we use also a very shadowy location. We emphasise these also using different lightings around the area, so just help to build up the conventions of the horror thriller genre. And then in addition, we applied a day to night filter on most of the clips so that it created a more tense atmosphere. And by taking out the brightness and colour, we were able to portray the female protagonist in a negative mindset. So when she was in any of the shots that she was in, we changed them to a day to night and made them more dull in order for her character to come across as more negative and to portray her negative mindset and feelings. And so likewise, where we see the male, we use the same technique in order to show his negative intent. And the shadows can be used to represent a number of themes. These are mystery, negative intent and doom, which is exactly what we wanted to portray through our film. And the idea of impending doom is something that we wanted to transfer, especially when the male character reveals that he at least knows something about the father's accident. That's where we wanted to portray that her fate is doomed through the casting of deep shadows on his face where they were previously absent. So where you see her with less shadows on her face, just thinking about her father, and then when his fate becomes a reality, when she meets the male character, those shadows get darker to show that her world's getting a bit more negative. So the antagonist wore dark clothing, a jumper, jeans and shoes. This all relates to the mise en scène because it's the costume. So the male wore the dark jeans and the dark green jumper to sort of connote that he's a negative character. And so through doing this, we met the conventions of other media products that we had looked at portray the antagonist wearing darker clothing. So following this convention helps to add to the ambiguity and the feeling of danger, as dark colours connote death and danger. Additionally, this would also help the audience to recognise the genre of the film in a more obvious manner. So the negative connotations link up to other horror films where audiences associate a person wearing darker clothing as those that have the ability to cause harm to the innocent and vulnerable characters. So where the protagonist and the antagonist were compared, that's where you'd see the contrast in what she was wearing, the light coloured shirt in comparison to what he was wearing, the dark coloured jumper. Then the female character, go into a bit more detail about what she was wearing. She was wearing quite casual clothing, so this doesn't represent her as being vulnerable as most horror thriller genres do, because we wanted to present the females as being strong individuals rather than weak and open to danger, so it would appear more to female audiences that would normally be aware of how they could be degraded and victimised because of their gender. So by casting a female protagonist, we managed to challenge and defy the stereotypical conventions of horror films, as they normally feature a male protagonist, but by including a female protagonist we sort of allowed for a development in gender roles. So yeah, it also just helps it to appear to a wider audience, considering that the other films that we'd looked at, when we looked at the ratings that they'd had, and the audience demographic, it was largely males. So by including the female protagonist, we were ensuring that our audience would not just be males but largely females because of the main character being a female. So when the sound, we used a non-diegetic tension building sound just in the first part of the opening. We fit the shots in with the music to make it more suspenseful, as well as overlaying sounds of bangs where you saw people's names, so that it created more suspense and to create sort of an intense atmosphere. So where we used shots of the investigation board, we decided that we were going to overlay sounds that related to what we were showing on the screen. So when you see about the police being accused of some kind of like miscellaneous action involved in the case, we overlaid sirens. Then where there was like letters and things, we did like whispering to signify people are talking about it, and there's like quite a lot of mystery and whatnot involved in the whole case. Then where there was a man, we did like a guy whispering, just to add a bit more depth and just generally create more interest around the film and to create a stronger narrative, because through the sounds we were able to reveal a bit more about the kind of feelings that the protagonist was feeling and how these implement upon the story itself. And then with editing, we've removed a lot of the colour in order to make the content seem bleaker, to replicate the feelings of some of the characters. And so I've already mentioned that, as well as the flashbacks, which we use just to reveal a bit more about the narrative. It begins with lots of flashbacks, and it's kind of unclear as to whether the shots are present day or not, so we use that in order to confuse the audience a bit, make them pay a bit more attention. So we saw this through the opening of Seven. It was very mysterious as to who the person was that was writing things down and all that, and we wanted to replicate those kind of feelings. When we looked at Seven, they did the same thing, and it was very interesting, and we wanted to replicate that. So that's what we did. We used lots of quick cuts, cut between different shots, in order just to make a stronger narrative and make it more interesting, basically. So with the editing, we just cut through different shots, flashing backwards and forwards into present day, as well as using shots alongside sound in order to build up the narrative. And this sort of conforms to the psychological thriller aspect of the genre, because in most of the psychological thrillers that we had seen, flashbacks and flash forwards had been used in order to like confuse the audience slightly and make for a stronger narrative. So on set we tried to capture a variety of different shots and angles. The next point I wanted to make was about the camera and how that conforms to the stereotypes of different movies that we'd looked at that shared the same genre. So basically when we were on the set and we were filming, we tried to capture a variety of different shots and angles, so we'd have a choice of different ones that we could use when it comes to the editing stage. This conforms to the conventions of horror and thriller, as these all use many different kinds of shots and angles and things just to capture every aspect and to make the viewer feel as though they are entirely part of the movie itself, so they could see every angle as they would if they were actually there. One thing we really wanted to include was a point of view shot, because we felt like this would bring the audience even further into the narrative and make them feel as though they were part of it. This is a POV shot from the protagonist point of view, so it makes the viewers feel as though they protagonist in the story. It makes them feel like a good character rather than an antagonist, bad character. We used high and low angle shots to show the power between different characters. So where we had the female character, female protagonist, we would try and angle her shots downwards, the shots of her downwards, and then shots of the male we would put them upwards, just to show the difference in power between the two. Although most of the shots that we ended up using didn't show this angle quite as much as we had have hoped, which is something that we'd improve on if we were to have more time to spend on it. These just show the different perspectives of the different characters. With the titles, this is one of the most important stereotypical conventions of a film, because it reveals what the film's going to be. Within those few first shots, you get to know the genre of the film. By using, as I previously mentioned, the low lighting and the sound effects, and the music was very fast beat, we managed to make it seem as though it was a psychological thriller horror, by conforming to those expectations already set by other thrillers and horrors. It meant that it's more obvious for an audience to identify what genre it is. So in that instance, we decided to conform to it rather than subvert it, as it seemed to work better for viewership. We decided on the name of Stalk Thy Neighbour for our title, because it seemed fitting in that it reveals more about the antagonist, because from that you can gather that he must be stalking her. So the shots that we used after the title of Stalk Thy Neighbour reveal that somebody's being stalked, which is suggested in the title, and that this person is close to someone. So in this instance, we get to know that the male character must know the female character in some way, and so they're closely linked like that, and he's stalking her, which is what we wanted to portray. So we felt that the title equally summed up the relationship between the two characters and what was actually going on between those two. So it reveals a little bit more about the narrative without having to actually say it. So we tried to portray this obviously through the investigation boards, as well as the shots and the dialect, but particularly we thought if we put a lot of information into the title, it would make it more obvious for viewers to understand the narrative. We took inspiration for our titles from sci-fi movies. Often they'd use like a typewritery computer kind of style typography in order to connote the idea of technology being used as part of the plot. Given that one of the props that we used was a car, we wanted to have that kind of like development of modern technology to be seen as like dangerous, and considering the title is Stalk Thy Neighbour, we wanted the neighbour to be related to the technology, which is dangerous for the protagonist and her father. The location that we used for our film was set in an estate in Banbury Town. This area holds the same aesthetic as a village location, because it's like a small cul-de-sac, just like a village. So rural settings, this is more rural than doing it in the middle of town, so rural settings are often a convention of horrors and psychological thrillers because they connote the idea of isolation. This factor contributes to the overall vulnerability of the characters and their isolation within that location. So normally in horror psychological thrillers, these are the feelings that we want to be emphasised to the viewers in order for them to feel the same way as the characters do. We wanted to transfer the idea that the characters are vulnerable and therefore the viewership are just as vulnerable as they are.